Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we're going to be talking about red green refactor versus refactor red green refactor. And so this has been kind of an interesting thing that I've noticed. Austin, maybe what do you think? Do you want to talk about what it means to you, and then I can go into what it means to me?
Yeah, I feel like this one might be like similar other episodes we've done in the past where there's kind of this spectrum of practices. So, as opposed to mobbing pattern practices, this is like refactoring pattern practices. And I feel like there's a spectrum and a pendulum, and there's different uses for different cases. At least I've seen in my experience. So, the traditional red-green refactor, I feel like, is like classic test-driven developments. At least the kind of like mini TDD loop or micro loop. I think I can post something in the show notes that talks about the different levels of TDD loops, like the micro, the macro, et cetera. But at least in the micro TDD loop, it's very bottom-up approach, way to discovery and design and refactoring. And so the first thing you do, the red, is you write a failing test. And this is a wonderful thing to do as a mob. Because it gets the mob on the same page of the intent of at least the navigator, or usually often the whole mob. And then it goes red. And so, and then once it's red, then to go green, you can hack together whatever code makes the code go green. So I guess we can think of a very simple example, like I'll set up a potential refactoring here, Chris, with a kata I know you've used several times with animals making different noises, right? So it's a command line tool that will output animal noises, for example. So you put in cat and it makes a meow sound or something, right? And so you hack whatever code is possible to make the test pass. And so that goes red, green, and then you refactor. So the first loop might be just rename a couple variables because you're only doing one thing, and then you go through the loop again, but this time you do a second animal behavior, or you can go negative and be like, what if you put in a noun animal or a weird input, and then you go red, make the test fail, make it pass, and then refactor again. And as you go, you might refactor to more elegant designs, maybe even a design pattern of some kind. And so, yeah, that's kind of my experience with red-green refactor. And as a mob, it's pretty beautiful because there's usually people in the mob with lots of refactoring experience, and kind of get that different opinions shown out there, and you try different ones until you get one that works. So yeah, anything to add to red-green refactor, Chris? Maybe before you jump into the other thing you said that sounded like Dr. Seuss.
Yeah. I think the interpretation of that, and maybe one of the pitfalls that I think I find is that, especially when you come into code that has been tested but hasn't been looked at in a long time, you may, just make the next failing test, and then you'll see lots of refactoring opportunities. And a lot of people are like, oh, let's just rename that while we're going forward, and so there's like these small refactoring suggestions that actually distract from like the that end goal of getting it green and then refactoring afterwards. And so I think that it's really interesting, the effect of red green refactor. Everybody kind of wants to jump at those refactorings like right in the middle. So I often recommend, like, okay, well, write those down as you go, but don't bring them up until you hit the green, and then come back to them during the refactoring step, that, kind of queuing up those changes. And so, that can really help in the process, because the design morphs over time. But I think that in a regular environment, so like you'll work on katas, right? And katas are really great. Red green refactor fits into a kata really well because you start from a clean slate and you have context on the architecture each time. But I think what some people that don't realize might be happening when they're doing katas and starting over and over again is like is, what does TDD look like in an environment where you're bouncing between code bases, and so you're working on a multi-tier server client or microservice application. What what I think tends to happen is you try and fit into the existing framework to get that red green going, and then refactoring, and that can lead to all sorts of complications, like not really understanding the code as much as maybe refactoring beforehand would. So maybe that's kind of like where I see katas going into production work have some pain points, right?
Nice. Yeah. And I think maybe it's picking the right tool for the job. Like I think what you said, like just starting with red, green refactor is perfect for a kata. And I think it translates really nicely to some projects that already have some nice architecture. So for example, hey, we want to add a new page or a new component or a new backend serverless function. You kind of can just start as if it were a kata, because it's basically you're making a new leaf in the node object graph of your app or your system, right? And so it can be tested independently as if from scratch, so to speak. And so I think it works really nicely there. But I think you make a really good point, is that the Dr. Seuss one, was it refactor? Red, green refactor?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Is that if you come into, say, a maybe more legacy code base, and I've been in some of these recently, they've been around 20 years or something, and maybe it's like spaghetti, maybe it at least feels like spaghetti to you because you're not familiar with it. And I love the picture you painted where when people are tempted to refactor a ton and we're only like half a step into doing the first red, it's probably a sign that this is a good time to do a refactor, red, green refactor instead of the normal one, because I think the cost you'll pay if you do the red, green refactor is that you're going to have to do a lot of refactor and you're going to make a lot of mess that you're going to have to clean up right away, right? When people are already seeing that there's a better way to design this. So this probably stems back to some degree to Kent Beck's make the change easy, then make the change, right? I believe it was
make it easy to change, and then in parentheses, which is hard, which may be hard, and then make the easy change.
Right, exactly, yeah. And so you're like, okay, it seems pretty clear that this team or this mob wants to refactor this first, probably for good reason. They're all feeling something in their gut that something's off here. So then you do the refactoring first, and then it should be easy to make the change, right? And I guess that's a test of your refactor you just did, is the change you're about to make for the new feature you're working on just slides right in, right?
Yeah, and I think, like, kind of to add to that, I find that consolidating branching logic and so, like, especially if you come into a code base that's fully tested, right? So if it's not fully tested, then you're going to vice everything. Very similar to a vise that you use during woodworking. You vise the piece of wood and then you work on it. You vice test your existing legacy code and then work on it. And then at that point you have a good opportunity to just refactor and a few things that I think I look for, especially if people are confused by the naming, is just straighten out all of the naming, right? And then from there, now that you've kind of looked at the names, you can kind of break things down. But I think, like, just eliminating branching logic in general, refactoring to design patterns that allow you to remove kind of if statements can be really helpful, because then you have a framework for adding one more or whatever new scenarios that you might come up with, and a number of options. But I think renaming and reducing cyclomatic complexity can give you a really good picture of what you need to operate on next to actually make the feature that you want to make. Even if you don't really know or understand the code very much. It's a very enlightening process to just go through and say, actually, I don't think this thing's really named as well as it could be, because this thing goes to that thing. Especially if there's like technical detail in the names that exist in the code, that can also be a really good opportunity to reduce technical detail in the names, but introduce that technical detail into the syntax, or make it more obvious. Then those things can be really good too.
Nice. Yeah, and I think, I really like all that you said, and I like what you said about the vice tests, and that's my go-to before making any changes at all, refactoring or going red then green. But I will add the exception is a couple exceptions maybe. One is that's more of a growth area for me, is kind of Arlo's refactoring without tests kind of stuff. So if you can do provably safe refactorings, you don't necessarily need the vice test. So if it's like you're in C# and it's demonstrably provably safe to rename something safely or extract a method, then you can do so. And the other exception I had too, that has proved pretty helpful in many scenarios, and I really like the terminology that Andrew Hunt and Dave Thomas used in the book, The Pragmatic Programmer, is they had this analogy of tracer bullets. So if you're in the prototype phase for a piece of work where maybe the customer doesn't really know what they want, and we're not quite sure how all the pieces of the system are going to glue together. And what I've seen is where we will intentionally red, green refactor, TDD, but leave quite a bit of mess, just because we're trying to get one tracer bullet through the whole system to get to some stakeholders or customers to try it out with a feature flag or something, right? Absolutely. And so in those cases, I sometimes have to turn my refactor brain off at least a little bit, because what we're trying to do is prove, is this thing even worth pursuing at all? Right. Yeah. And so a little bit of tests help and a little bit of refactor help. But if you go too gung-ho, you might be fully cleaning something that you're going to throw away in a week, right? So,
and I think I maintain the distinction there between a spike and productionifying that spike.
Yes.
And so, some people do spikes without tests. Some people do kind of what you're describing there, where it's just red, green, red, green, red, green, red, green, red, green refactor.
Yeah.
And I think both are appropriate, like depending on opportunity cost. But what you don't want is red, green, red, green, red, green, red, green, and then 6 months later refactor, red,
yes.
refactor. But also when people come back into that code, they may that refactoring exercise, when they come back in, can actually be very informative. But I think the drawback is that the business doesn't get a sense of what it takes to properly finish the feature from a time and budget and cost perspective.
Yes.
And so it can be very dangerous to do 50 red greens and then wait until the feature is touched again to do the first refactor. That's very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and whenever I've done something like that, I use the language of prototype, or what's some of the other things, non-production ready, kind of stuff. Because what I find is that a little bit of a moderate amount of TDD helps you not break yourself if your experiment's longer than a few days, because you start breaking yourself after a while, I've noticed. But too much of it with prototype will lead to throwing away code that's not used. So yeah, if you're truly experimenting. Cool. Yeah, anything left to talk about before we close this one out, Chris?
I just think that be aware of the scenario, and then also I think be aware of the impressions of the outside stakeholders as well. And if this is something that you're maintaining for a long time, lean into that. Keep it clean, high quality. It's likely that the code you're working on now is going to last decades. So, I think in most cases, a lot of it does. And so, even be nice to that person that works on it 10 years later.
Be nice to your future self as well.
Yeah. Exactly. So, yep. That's it.
Right on. Well, what's your opinion, audience, on red, green refactor and refactor, red, green refactor? What's your thoughts? When have you used either? When have you seen it not work well? When have you seen it work well? We love your comments in YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and more. But until next time, mob well and have a good one, everybody. Bye.
Have a good one.